Hi class, I'm back with the remainder of chapter 3 video, and so I will go ahead without further ado and share the screen and get started. So let's see where we are here. We are on objective 3, and that is to describe self-report measures. So first off, what are self-report measures? Well, it's just simply asking people to report their attitudes, their feelings, or their behavior, and they're going to report it themselves. So that can be done via a survey, also known as a questionnaire, or a face-to-face interview. It's got a lot of advantages, and a lot of psychologists use self-report measures. We do it all the time, a lot. Okay, and it's probably the most common way of measuring data in the social sciences. You get a lot of data, you get it really fast. There are tons of good measures that are out there. Surveys are already out there, and they're free, and that's fantastic. The disadvantage is the accuracy of the data, and we will talk some more about that later. Okay, well, one of the ways you can do it is to ask open-ended questions. Open-ended question just essentially doesn't have an answer. So for example, how do you typically handle interpersonal difficulties with your coworkers? And then you just write out the answer. That's why it's open-ended. It could be any ending, any answer. People feel free to respond in their own words. Therefore, the advantage of it is that you get unexpected responses. We can also find out what people actually know. You know what I mean? We can say, what are your policies on gender discrimination, for example, at your institution? We can find out what they actually know. The biggest difficulty in the scoring is that it becomes difficult to score a paragraph of written words, much more difficult than it is to score the closed-ended questions, because you've got to do what's called a content analysis, and we'll talk about that more later in the class. Let's take a look at closed-ended measures. A closed-ended measure is a measure that has an answer embedded in the question itself. So for example, a multiple choice question. I go to parties, never, always. You can check anywhere along that line. So that closed-ended forces you to answer in a particular way. The advantage is that it's very, very easy to code. Because you just can code it by which, we can score it by which, where you put the X on that line. And then the disadvantage, however, is that a poorly worded question can confuse participants. And you might argue that what is this question? What is a party, for example? Or does everyone interpret that word the same way? If I have 2 or 3 people over to my room, is that a party? You know what I mean? Does it have to be a big party? Do alcohol and drugs have to be involved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So people interpret things in different ways, of course. And you can't tell how they did interpret it. Okay, well, a very common way of doing a closed-ended question is what we call a Likert scale. And that's a statement that we write. So it's not a question with a question mark. It's a statement with strongly agree to strongly disagree. And it's usually on a 5-point scale or a 7-point scale. The one I've got on this slide is a 7-point scale, but you could do 5 just as well. It does, one of the nice things about it is that it allows the freedom for somebody to be neutral. You can be right in the middle. On this scale, you got, if you hit a 4, you neither agree nor disagree. It's somewhere neutral in the middle. It'll also allows you to feel strongly in one way or another. What happens on this particular scale is that you have a lot of items that measure the same variables. For example, this is how you feel about the computer software you've been using. I'm satisfied with it. It's simple to use. It's fun to use. It all evaluates that computer software. And so because of that, you can then sum up the scores and you can get a general measure of how they feel about that software. You could also take a mean on those scores. Here's another example, if you'd like to pause the video and check out another example there. That one is a 5-point scale. Some more examples of closed-ended measures is, for example, the forced choice scale. And that's where, you have the same kind of thing. Notice But now you have only 4 options. The neutral option has been taken away. And sometimes there's good reason to do this if you feel like people don't want to take a side. It kind of forces them to take a side. So on this question, I approve of legalized abortion in case of rape. Many people will not want to take a side on this issue. But the way that the question is worded here, it forces you to either go with agree or disagree. You can't be neutral on it. Okay, another possible scale is the semantic differential scale, and that is using adjectives on either side to rate concepts. So you take, for example, Megan Thee Stallion. Is she strong, weak, active, passive, good, bad? You could rate her on any of these in using these bipolar adjectives there. Okay, objective number 4. I want to talk about some of the general guidelines for how you would write good self-report items, because it is really an art to write a good survey. So we'll talk about some of those. The first one is keep it simple. Use words that a 3rd grader would understand. You need to be able to get all your participants to understand. So you want to write at the lowest common denominator so that everyone understands. Make those questions short. Nobody wants to read a big old long question. Use words and terms that will not be misinterpreted. For example, you wouldn't want to use the term comfort zone, right? Because what is comfort zone? You want to make sure that everybody is interpreting the term in exactly the same way. You want to avoid personal questions unless you really need the information. So if you're not measuring ethnicity, don't put a question in there about ethnicity. There's no need to, because that's going to it's going to arouse suspicion. It's going to make people feel uncomfortable. If you're measuring drug use, yeah, measure drug use. But if you don't want to, if that's not important to your study, don't put in a question about drug use, because it's a personal question again. So you don't want to arouse suspicion or resistance, or make people think that, you're doing something, measuring something that could hurt them later. Okay. Number 4, make sure respondents have the knowledge to answer. So for example, if somebody asked, how many calories do you consume per day? Do you even have that knowledge? I mean, you don't really know, right? And so if you ask something like that, it's really important to at least give the option of don't know, because most people just don't know the answer to that. So they're essentially making it up. So it's not a very good question. Avoid biased items. Your aim is to get accuracy. So for example, you might ask a Likert type item that says, I like pornography. That's an okay item. But you don't want conformity. So you don't want the item, I approve of the horrible way that pornography poisons the minds of young people. So you can see the researchers' intent in that question. They want you to go in a certain way. They want you to be against pornography. So you don't want to ask it in the way that is biased. Try to ask it as neutral as possible. Another thing you want to do is avoid what we call a double-barreled question. A double-barreled question is when you pack 2 questions into one, 2 or 3 sometimes. So consider this question. High schools need to spend more time on students' emotional and physical development. Again, it's a Likert type item rated on a scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. But the problem is it asks 2 things. It asks about emotional development and it asks about physical development. Well, you need to ask that in 2 different questions, not in one question, because if you ask it in one question, you don't know what they're responding to. Are they responding to both? Are they responding to one? Or are they responding to the other? So if you see a question with and or, nor, but, that's usually a tip off that you've got a double-barreled question in there. Those are very, very common. Okay, choose response items carefully. Response items should be exhaustive in the sense that they should cover everything. And if you need to put in an item that says don't know, put in an item that says don't know or neutral, so you can cover everything, every possibility. So typically with gender nowadays, we do ask the question of male, female, but then you might have other options, for example, like other. Right? And because you want to cover all possibilities there. Um, and they should also be mutually exclusive. They shouldn't overlap with one another. And so you don't want to have male and then masculine, for example, because there's some overlap there. So you want to make sure that each one is exclusive of the other option. You want to avoid the term not. In a question, if you say, I am not supportive of family members, okay? That question, a lot of times the not will be ignored. And so we try not to use that word not. And so this person may read the question, I am supportive of family members, in which it would mean a totally different thing. So what we want to do is, instead of saying not, you would say, for example, the professor was disorganized is a better question than the professor was not organized, because the not organized, they could read, because they're reading really quickly, that the professor was organized. And so we want to make sure they don't miss that not. And so we word things in a way that doesn't require the not. Typically, we do something that we call reverse scoring of some questions. We have a problem where people stop reading questions if the questions all look like they're asking the same thing in the same way. And so what you want to do is change a way in different questions, change the way you're asking them. So, for example, consider this, phrasing the question in an alternate way. Students should have more free time during the school day. That's fine as one question. But then as another question, you should say, students should spend the majority of the day occupied with assignments. So you can see it's phrased in the opposite way. So if they answered strongly agree to one of those, to the first one, they should answer strongly disagree to the second one. It forces them to read the questions more. Finally, we generally add demographic questions: age, gender, education. We need to find out who the people are. We don't need to find their names, but we do need to find out if they are representative of the population. So we have a sample, let's say, of Lincoln University students. We want to make sure that our sample represents the population. So we need to find out their age, their gender, and their, well, in this case, education wouldn't make sense. Okay, but at any rate, we need to ask those questions. This becomes important for your methods section. Age and gender are the minimum there. Okay. I want to talk about one more thing, or two more things here. One is describing the problem of reactivity and how to minimize it. Reactivity is when you know that you're being measured, and sometimes that leads to dishonest answers. There's a particular bias that we call the social desirability bias, and that's when people answer in a way that makes them look good. So if you ask, for example, how often do you lie? Well, people are going to tend to underestimate that. If you ask what people's GPA is, they're going to tend to overestimate. That's called the social desirability bias. They want to look good. They want to look in a particular way. So we've got to minimize that bias because we want the most truthful answers. So we can minimize reactivity in several ways. One is using anonymous measures. Anonymous measures make people think that, oh, well, she doesn't know who I am anyway, so it doesn't matter what I put, I can be honest. So my name is not on there. Hiding the purpose of the study is a good way, but again, there are ethical problems with that, so we've got to be very careful. Sometimes people actually measure social desirability. There are several scales out there to measure it, and once we measure it, then we can remove it statistically afterwards. I know that's beyond the scope of this class, but that can be done, so sometimes it's measured. Okay, I want to finally describe behavioral and psychophysiological measures. Behavioral measures are actually watching and recording actual behavior. And that is when you just sit down and you record people's behavior. So these are not self-report measures that we've been talking about, where you ask people what they feel, what they think, what they do. You just sit down and you record their behavior, you watch them. You can record the frequency of behaviors. For example, I did a study years ago looking at the frequency to which people touch their face. And we just sat and we watched them. And counted how many times they touched their face. Intensity of the behavior. You could measure the intensity, for example, of an aggressive episode between children. Duration of the behavior, how long the behavior lasts. The latency to do a particular behavior, how long it takes to do a behavior. Those are all things you can measure in behavior. One advantage is if they don't know that you're recording them, let's say you're just sitting in a public park recording children playing on a playground, they are going to not be reactive. They're not going to do things because they're being recorded, because they don't even know if they're being recorded. So that's a great advantage. And if you do it in a public place where anybody could see behavior anytime, you don't need to, there aren't as many ethical problems there. A disadvantage of that is that you really have to develop a coding system for the behavior. And you have to make sure that the coding system is used consistently. And for that, we use something called inter-rater reliability, where two raters will watch the same thing and make sure that they are both recording it the same way. So let's take you can look at that example of the behavioral measure. I'm going to go on to the physiological measure. If you want to pause here, you can do a little quiz on the behavioral measure. Okay, psychophysiological measure would be something like heart rate. So it's a physiological measure. It's something about the body, but it means something about one's psychology. So for example, heart rate and blood pressure can be measures of stress. Reactivity is generally pretty low because it's very hard for people to control their heart rate, even if they want to. So that's an advantage of it. In a study by Cunningham, for example, he measured sympathetic nervous system and brain activity in people who were viewing black and white faces. And he found that different race faces provoked more anxiety, even when the person claimed not to be racist. And so just viewing that face invoked a sympathetic nervous system reaction in the person's body. And again, they were claiming not to be racist, but yet this reaction was happening, a kind of a stress reaction. So that shows you psychophysiological measures. That is our last objective for chapter 3. And I'm hoping you're having a great day. Thank you for listening.